Namaskar, this is Akhilesh Bhargava. Welcome to Tit-Bits on Business and Finance with me. If we have to identify those industrial groups that dominate India's business and economic landscape, particularly with reference to their rapid and unending expansion, with reference to their easy entry even into unrelated businesses, with reference to the non-stop availability of funds to them despite their poor track record so far by way of return on investment, with reference to the perennial availability of liquidity for takeovers to them, their unending opportunities for growth irrespective of their eligibility for them or not, their proximity to the government and the clout and comfort in the system, the cornering of resources and markets by them, their overbearing dominance in the sectors that they enter into, their ability to litigate and to take on the judiciary, their stark indifference to controversies, if any, their opaque ownerships through interlocked shareholdings which tend to distort the real picture. If we were to identify groups with reference to these characteristics in particular, then there are just two groups in India which have the ability to game the Indian system. It is the Ambanis who have been old hands at it, and now it is the Adanis also. Both these groups remain unchallenged in their own universe, with no traditional Indian business group able to challenge their fierce dominance or match their system clout. And this, incidentally, was a subject matter of what the Business Standard calls a masterful presentation by Sri Arvind Subramanian, India's former chief economic advisor at the Brown University recently. He calls the multi-sector dominance by these two A's, Adani and Ambani, as something unique in the history of global capitalism, not just Indian capitalism. The fact is that in a number of countries, select business groups have dominated the local economy to corner national resources, to build monopolies, and to eliminate competition, all resulting in the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few, which is not good for that nation, whether it be economically, socially, or even politically. The Business Standard in its write-up compares these two A's, which is Ambani and Adani, with the Chaebols of South Korea and the Zaibatsus of Japan, which have indeed dominated the economies of those two powerful economies since decades, and they now also continue to do so. Like the South Korean Chaebols and the Japanese Zaibatsus, these two groups are hugely diversified and they continue to be even more so. From being the largest importer of coal in India to being the biggest operator of ports and airports in India to a major presence in solar energy, etc., the Adanis continue to expand at a robust pace, while the Ambanis, on the other hand, are giant players in items like petrochemicals, petroleum, telecom, online platforms, organized retail, etc. The Business Standard incidentally points to some common Chaebol-like features of these two large, powerful groups, trying to compare the Indian landscape with that in South Korea and in Japan. It says that both of them stand out for their hunger for dominance, widely believed to be facilitated by favored government treatment in India. It then says that both the Adanis and the Ambanis have close links with the government and a reputation of immense clout in the government. Both of them have had breakthrough business acumen. They have not crossed each other's path so far, it notes, but they will soon do so in green energy and petrochemicals as we go by the recent developments. No one can deny today the reach, influence, power and diverse portfolio of these two A's in India, which is Ambani and Adani. But the question is whether they are the Indian equivalent of, say, the South Korean Chaebols, the South Korean business conglomerates, and will their continued expansion and domination be good for India or not? Before we compare these two Indian groups to the South Korean Chaebols, which have been similar to the Japanese Zaibatsus, let us understand what the Chaebols have been and what have they done to South Korea. What has been their trajectory? How long have they come? And how big are they? As the word goes, Chaebol in the Korean language means a rich business family or clan. And so the word Zaibatsu means so in the Japanese language. These giant business conglomerates, industrial powerhouses, had humble beginnings in South Korea in the 30s, 40s, and the 50s. And they are actually credited with transforming South Korea from being a low-key agrarian economy in the 60s to a technology giant now. From a nation whose exports, which used to be a mere 4% of GDP, these conglomerates have now transformed their nation where exports constitute 40% of its GDP, and that too consists mostly of high-tech items. The growth of these conglomerates has lifted millions of South Koreans out of poverty, and its per capita income has galloped from $120 in the 60s to $27,000 now. The fact is that the rapid economic growth of South Korea since the 1960s was led by a Chaebol-centered development strategy, which the governments there pursued consciously and consistently. There are 30 such Chaebols or business conglomerates in South Korea, of which the top 5 represent over 50% of the market capitalization of the South Korean stock exchanges. The top 10 of these Chaebols own 25% of the total business assets of South Korea, and the top 20 of them account for about 2/3 of the total exports of their nation. Their dominance, their clout, their wealth, their reach has been so much. The rise of these groups is due to close cooperation and massive support from the South Korean government by way of generous subsidies, loans, tax incentives, and concessions to them to the exclusion of others. It is such constant support from the government that has helped these groups to expand and diversify and to capture its economy. For example, its largest Chaebol, Samsung, started out as a small company that exported fruit, dried fish, and noodles to China. But it is today a diversified giant with a global presence in electronics, insurance, ships, luxury hotels, hospitals, etc. And they are a dominant force in all these segments. The other one, Hyundai, started as a small construction company but is today a major global player in automobiles, shipbuilding, finance, and electronics. The distinguishing features of these conglomerates and their impact on the South Korean nation need to be understood before we do a reality check whether Ambani and Adani are in the same league as these South Korean Chaebols or not. And what are these features? The first thing that we need to realize is that the Chaebols are large business conglomerates controlled by their founding families, and they continue to do so. Their preeminence there has not been dismantled, despite the many promises of the South Korean government to do so, particularly when in 1997, the country faced an economic crisis on account of the huge debt that was given to these groups. The second feature is that these groups have had a symbiotic relation with the government there, with each supporting the other. The South Korean government has supported these groups to the exclusion of all others, and the Chaebols in turn have copiously rewarded the ruling politicians through massive bribes running in tens of hundreds of millions of dollars, or rather billions of dollars. The bribery and corruption there has been so blatant and right up to the top that 2 South Korean presidents have been convicted so far on charges of corruption, of course involving the Chaebols. These groups have built a domineering monopoly in whichever sector they operated in, and that has led to an unfair playing field for the small sector, for the MSMEs there in particular, leading to the exploitation of contractors and the decimation of the small sector in South Korea. The small in South Korea have not been able to compete at all, and the fact that they are at the mercy of the big ones has led to a decline in innovation, creativity, and competition in South Korea. Their grip on the economy has been vice-like always. It has led to the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few in South Korea, which is anti-democracy, and has generated widespread public discontent also there. The next is that despite promises to do so, the government in South Korea has been slow to implement Chaebol reforms, and it continues to pursue pro-Chaebol policies even now. Even the South Korean courts have incidentally been extra lenient to the Chaebols and to their founding promoters. The courts there openly say that these groups are so valuable to the national economy in South Korea that it is not in public interest to hold them accountable for their crimes. This is something pretty unique in the matter of justice globally, we think. In a classic 3x5 formula, the courts there award a 3-year prison sentence to the powerful Chaebol owners for their crimes. They then suspend the punishment for 5 years and they finally drop it, saying that they committed no further crime during the 5-year probation period and so they must not be sent to jail. That has been a time-tested formula as far as conviction of the Chaebol promoters is concerned in South Korea, despite the economic crimes that they have committed. Thus, the economic crimes and the deviant behavior of the founding families have been actually accepted and condoned in national interest by the courts there. It is for all these reasons that Chaebol reforms remain slow, tentative, and incomplete in South Korea, and these groups continue to wield extraordinary wealth, power, and influence there. The question is whether the Ambanis and the Adanis are the Indian Chaebols or not, and whether they are heading in that direction. The fact of the matter is that though their structure and trajectory looks to be the same as the South Korean Chaebols, yet whether the Ambanis and the Adanis are the Chaebols or not, the answer is a mixed one, which is both a yes and a no. Like in the case of the Chaebols, they certainly do have government connect and clout in a big way, but they are not blatantly rewarded with generous subsidies and tax breaks as we see in the case of the South Korean conglomerates and the government there. These two, which is Ambani and Adani, certainly dominate their sectors ruthlessly, but that is restricted to domestic markets only, unlike in the case of the South Korean Chaebols, which have captured global markets because of their size and their ability to compete. The Ambanis and the Adanis are clearly seen to be favored by the government, though not so as openly as happens in South Korea. And unlike the Chaebols, they are relatively small in size and are yet to corner the total national resources of India in a big way. The interesting point is that the South Korean Chaebols have become global giants to straddle the world and to dominate world markets, while these two, which is the Ambanis and the Adanis, only dominate the Indian markets. For example, Hyundai is the third largest car maker in the world. Hyundai Shipbuilding is the largest shipbuilding company in the world. SK Hynix is the world's second largest maker of memory chips. And just one subsidiary of the Samsung Group, which is Samsung Electronics, contributes to 15% of the South Korean GDP. They have become so big. They have dominated global markets, and that is the key difference between the South Korean conglomerates and the Indian ones when we try to see whether they have become Chaebols or not. But then finally, if the Indian groups, which is the Ambanis and the Adanis or others, if they continue to grow like this, then all the ills of economic concentration and dominance by such groups, as we see in South Korea, will emerge in India also, which today anyway faces the curse of such concentration by way of huge inequality in the economy. It was a good point raised by Sri Arvind Subramanian, whether the two A's are the Chaebols or not, and that they are an interesting situation in the global capitalism today. The point that we would continue to watch is, will they grow so big, such that they are able to completely dominate the Indian economy, as we see in the case of Chaebols in South Korea? We think that just two groups rather, if they manage to monopolize a nation and economy like India, then it is certainly going to be anti-capitalism, anti-democracy, and not good for the society. This is Akhilesh Bhargava signing off till we meet again. Namaskar.